I think that's all I've got to say. So welcome, Eve, and over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Alison. And hello, everybody, and thank you for coming along. Yes, I'm an archaeologist. I work for Historic Environment Scotland, and I've been with them and their predecessor body, the Royal Commission on Ancient Monuments, for quite a long 30 years. I spent a lot of my time surveying and mapping archaeological sites, mostly in the Highlands, occasionally in some of the islands. But in the last 10, 15 years or so, I've been increasingly concentrating on encouraging local communities, community groups, volunteers, so on, to start exploring their local landscapes, history, their archaeology, their townscapes, whatever, for themselves. Yeah, rather than just being the expert who comes in to tell you what's what, and just, you know, it's I'd rather start conversations than just them. They're going to impose upon you my truths. Alison, I said, had asked me to do this lecture. You had John Moore from Glasgow, who was talking about James Turnbull and his map and his career a wee while ago. And I thought I would just broaden that out a little bit to talk more about what we can get from, I want to talk more generally about land surveyors in the 18th century, but most particularly how we can use their work today. Now, before a couple of weeks ago, I think Alison asked me, could I supply a text in advance and so on? And I thought, well, no, I can't, because I never talked to texts. And if I wrote a text out, I wouldn't look at it. So this, I just put my slides together and I'm just talking at them. So hopefully I won't get lost, but we'll see. But if we get lost, we'll find a way out, okay? So let's go. 18th century surveyors and agricultural change in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. The agricultural change bit is important to me as an archaeologist, because these surveyors obviously weren't just doing things for their own amusement, nor were their employers commissioning their work just to have a work of art to admire. They were actually, they were asking a product that would help them in the process of agricultural change. We're dealing really with the period from about 1750, certainly in the Highlands and Islands, from 1750 up to 1850, when the rural landscape of Scotland changed utterly. And here I think is a good example. I think, is this pointer visible?
Yes.
It is good, right? Okay. This is Loch Lomond. There's looking from somewhere above Balloch, looking north. There we've got the Highland Boundary Fault coming down off Connick Hill and across the loch there. In the foreground, we have the lowlands, and they look as most people, certainly those who live in the lowlands and in most of Britain, really think the countryside ought to look. Neat rectilinear fields, hedgerows, patches of woodland, isolated farms. And that's how we think the countryside is and ought to be. And beyond it, the Highlands, and this view sums up what many people's perception of what the Highlands are like. It's kind of forestry, barren moorland, lots of mountains and so on, and some sheep and some deer and not much else. And they think that's how it is. But these two things are entirely creations of the age of improvement from the, let's say, for sake of argument, 1750 to 1850. That century when the landscape of Scotland was completely altered. In the lowlands, that meant for farming, it meant new leases, it meant consolidation of the old jointly held farms into single tenant units. Leases were given out specifying improvements that were to be made. These would include things like draining the land, clearing it of stones, building these stone dikes that characterize them today, planting the hedgerows as to provide shelter from the wind. New crops were introduced. Sown grass, that was something that people didn't really do before. Sow grass just grows, doesn't it? New breeds of cattle, new breeds of sheep, of course, come in. And the landscape is just systematically just remade completely. in the Highlands, the perception there is, again, as I say, is of this mountains and sheep and so on. And a lot of that is about clearances, although the clearances are not universal. There are parts of the Highlands where the tenantry are, attempts are made at lowland improvement, such as we have in the foreground here. But neither of these things were inevitable. It's not how things naturally, it had been. It's all drawn up in estate offices by surveyors who were brought in and employed for that purpose by landowners looking to increase their yields and their profits. So Ian Adams, who was worked at the Scottish Record Office back in the 60s and 70s, once wrote a paper where he estimated that there were some 30,000 estate maps were created in Scotland in that. He runs from 1700 up to 1850, but the bulk of them come after 1750, many of these are held in big collections. There's the Inverness Archives, of course, that Alison looks after. There's a huge collection in the National Records of Scotland, and many are in private collections. Some are just isolated. Sometimes isolated maps are just remain in private hands. I might mention one or two of them. There is a lot of work to do on cataloguing these and sort of seeing what information we can get from them. But I'd like to explore this evening just how we've been using them increasingly over the past 15 years and what we, meaning archaeologists, hope to get out of them that will help us understand the landscapes that we are viewing and recording. Okay, so that my next slide. Yeah, it is. We come to some. As Alison said, I've never been to Chaidh. I'm afraid. I'm sorry. And I really don't know. I'm not really qualified to tell you very much at all about it, if anything. So I will start with this James Turnbull and his map, and I'll come back to it at the end. But most of the bulk of my talk really is going to be looking at some of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of decades in other parts of Scotland. But we will come back to Chaidh. But nevertheless, this is a quite wonderful map. It's just lovely. Alison sent me a copy of it, and I had our photographers make a print of it and so on. So this is huge, and I quite like to frame just because it's just great to look at as a piece of a piece of art, really. And that is something that I've had conversations, let's say, with a couple of geographers who specialize in historic maps. That when we started out doing, I was going to say doing things to maps, when we started sort of exploring the potential of releasing the data, let me see, put it that way, it's a bit ugly, but there we are. Once we started looking at getting the information that the maps held out and beginning to use it more actively, some people said to me that they disapproved. They said these are beautiful works of art. Why are you putting them in a computer and stretching them in ways that I was accused of impugning the integrity of a work of art at one point. And but it's the data that I'm after. Nevertheless, I can appreciate the map. This is a lovely one. And just to look at the detail, we have you've all probably seen, I understand you've been, this map's used as a springboard for various projects, so you'll all have seen it, that there's arable fields are shown. Turnbull shows different sorts of arable. He shows the good arable, the cornlands, are shown in yellow, and he uses a greenish color for the outfields, which are only occasionally cropped and otherwise left fallow to recover. And he shows all the farm boundaries, which is all kind of useful thing to do. And it's clear that he's taken some care over drawing these boundaries. When we zoom in a little bit, he is let's see, he's actually looking, yeah, he shows the buildings in the settlements, and the key on the bottom left of his map says that the buildings are shown as oblong squares, their situation and local places being exactly determined. How nice, that's good. And I'll come back to that again. But there we've got in this settlement here at the top left, you can see there's a burial place here, it says, by the old church. We've got various yards that that you might be able to pick out attached to the buildings. And he shows some archaeology. Down at the bottom right, we have an old Danish fort, all prehistoric sites, really, forts and dunes and brochs and things like that were all kind of normally called Danish forts, regarded as Danish works back in the 18th century. So how did he work? I'm sure you've probably seen this picture already, but I show it anyway. This is William Roy's survey party making the military map. And this is by Paul Sandby, who drew up Roy's map. He went on to become a really famous watercolorist. But he spent his winters in drafty Edinburgh Castle, drawing this up, probably by very poor light, drawing up the Roy's maps that I'm not going to talk about anymore. But we have the surveyor, presumably Roy there, with his theodolite. We have two flagmen to take the back sight, this guy, and the foresight. He is over there. And we have two chainmen with their 22-yard chain that was just kind of thrown out to measure again and again and again. They would work out the ray from the theodolite or the Adelaide, whatever he's got here, out towards the chain. Taking notes of measurements as they went. And then there's also a man to hold the horses. There would be somebody to look after Roy, and there would somebody to keep all the troops in order. And we have a couple of visitors here coming in. Now Roy did most of his work with one party of, I think it's 7 or 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. He did most of the Highlands, or much of them, on his own before he got extra teams were appointed late on in his survey. That's just a wonderful piece of work. I think John Moore talked quite a bit about the origins of Roy's survey, and David Watson, who was the man who instigated. Really, Watson's missing out. It should be Watson's survey, but Roy is the one we all remember. He went on to found the Ordnance Survey. But at that time, he wasn't a general, and he wasn't even in the army. He was a surveyor. He was attached to Watson, and he was a civilian at the time he did that. Okay, but that would have been the sort of thing that these surveyors would have done. Although they wouldn't have had such a large party, it would have been the surveyor and perhaps a couple of assistants who would have got paid 6p a day. I think in the 1760s was the going rate. There we are. Now, I started working, I'll come to the luchd-tomhais side a bit later on, but we started working there about 20 years ago, and we had a tremendous map to work with, that again, I will come to. And we were looking into how people had used 18th century maps before. Horace Fairhurst was professor of geography at Glasgow, and he did quite a lot of work on a couple of very, very famous archaeological excavations. He was trying to investigate the origins of post-medieval settlement, of which there are ruins everywhere. Pre-clearance settlement, if you like, but 18th, 19th, early 19th century farmsteads. And townships which were abandoned a couple of 100 years ago. And he tried to use estate maps. He tried at two particular sites, Licks and Ross. Licks, which is near just outside Linn in Perthshire at the west end of luchd-tomhais, and Rossall in Sutherland. There he had in Sutherland, he had Benjamin Meredith's map on the left, which shows the arable lands and lots of buildings dotted around, yeah. And this is Fairhurst's plan. Now, at both sites, Fairhurst had real trouble. While the general shape of the township was correct. He accepted it, it's a good job. And he mapped what cultivation he could see in the moorland. It corresponds more or less with what Meredith plotted, but the buildings didn't fit. There was a sort of general correspondence. You could see the settlements down here and the settlements down there. But what Fairhurst was trying to do, and the same he was found at Licks, he was trying to identify individual buildings on the earlier maps, and he couldn't. So he reasoned that that it was because these maps were a prelude to improvement. The surveyor was brought in because the land is going to improve. What his employer wants to know is, how much land is there? What's it like? How can I improve it to make it grow more crops? And perhaps incidentally, who's living there at the moment? Well, his rentals would have told him that. But this is all going to be cleared away and reorganized. Was Fairhurst's argument. So the surveyors probably didn't bother too much with the detail, with the exactness of the locations of settlement. So I just think back to what Turnbull is saying, that he had given exact, what was his phrase? The places were exactly determined. Fairhurst, I think, well, no, it doesn't work. They just didn't bother. So people stopped. After that was published, it was quite a kind of influential paper because people just stopped making use of early estate maps. And as late as the 80s, Ian Adams used to be at the Scottish Record Office at a conference, said that really there was no point in mapping this archaeology because it was already mapped back in the 17 and early 1800s. So there was no point in archaeologists looking at any of this stuff. The rural settlement as it was pre-improvement was preserved only in these estate maps, and there was nothing more to be done. That was very much the view at the time, and it was a view of a lot of archaeologists as well. Who'd much rather talk about prehistory than explore the settlement remains of the 17th and 18th century. So I'll leave that one at the moment there, and I'll come back to that when we get to luchd-tomhais. But I'll move on because I've just blathered too much. It's just like, let's move on. Yes. So some of these maps, I seem to bear out what Fairhurst said. This is George Taylor's plan of part of Badenoch, made for the Duke of Gordon. This is a map. The original is in private hands, and we were given lent it to photograph some years ago, but it's not in the archive. But this one shows lots of farm names, and that's interesting, and so on. But the boundaries, you can see people are going to go, well, these boundaries, they're quite. It's quite difficult to pin that down on the ground. It's a sort of general map there, and the settlements that are shown are kind of perhaps unlikely. If you scale that up, then this settlement is, these buildings are very large and spread over a huge area. It's all a bit unlikely. So that's the sort of, it's a general map. It is useful though. We do have some, just looking in on a couple of bits of it here. We've got up in the Gaich Pass up here. This is where we are up in Badenoch, to the east of Drumochter. Are we? Yeah, and we've got the Forester's Bothy is shown there. The one I really like is this little inset here, where it says "Stance of a Bothy built by Nude and thrown down by Ruthven." So there we are being told of a boundary dispute between the Nude and Ruthven estates that we might otherwise not really have known very much about at all. So that's I kind of use that as a map telling us something other than just showing us where places were. It's telling us a little bit of history. Another example is that I'm looking for Argyll examples. Glenrowan and Glen Shira, this is a building, or it was a building, and there are others, another one there, and that's Inverera's down there. We're in Glen Shira, to the northeast of Inverera. This settlement, we know, was abandoned in 1752, 54, something like one of them, when it disappears from the rentals. And at that time, the estate was being reorganized. This part of the Argyll estates was being reorganized in a big, ambitious improvement that was being put into effect, all enclosed by a dike. You see that stone wall up at the top there? That is this. It's the Garaz Cron, which is rough dike in Gaelic, I think. Somebody here will know. And it goes up the east side of Glen Shira. It goes over the hill down into Glenera and comes back down on the west side of the castle. I think, I don't know where it comes out. Alison may well know. But this dike, which is about taller than me, so there's no scale in there, but that's a huge thing, and it has a carriage drive on the upper side of it. You can see the rutted trackway there, and the idea was that visitors would come and look at the Duke's improvements down here, and they would admire the improvements that were taking place and in these fields, which this glen had been basically cleared out to make way for his experiments. And the centerpiece was the Mam Steading, which is still it's there. It's even less well preserved than it was when that photo was taken some 20-30 years ago. It's a bit of a sad state at the moment. But a massive cattle court that was constructed. Only half of it was ever built. It was meant to be a circular thing. And this is Robert Milne's plan of it. And it has a tea room specified. So the idea was you go for a drive, you admire what Duke's getting up to with his fields and so on. And then you come here and you'd admire his cows and presumably the midden in the middle. You'd admire that. And then you'd have a cup of tea and then you go home. Okay, good. That's... yeah, so these are various plans, 1797 for building. This is more or less what got built. And I put that in really because, again, we have an estate map here, and I realized this morning that I can't zoom in close enough for you to see the detail on this one. But each of this is Glen Shira, and we're really showing there's most of it there, and the map really extends all the way up here. And each of these fields is donated. It's an 1806 map, and it shows that there are peas, potatoes, oats grown. It's telling you what's been grown in each field, and one or two of them are labelled experiment field without further explanation. And so, I'm not sure what's happening there. But again, this map is a snapshot from 1806. Telling us exactly what was happening in the glen. The Mam Steading thing is here. Okay. Other examples. I'm going to whisk north to near Tomintoul. We're on the Gordon estates, and the Gordons were great ones for surveying or having surveyed what they owned, for which I am very grateful. And we'll look at a couple of sites here. I want to start with this one, which is on this is a settlement known as Eileanan of Cruachley. It's about a mile outside Tomintoul. It's now pasture. The site's abandoned in the 19th century. But you can still see, this is off Google Earth, you can still see footings of the buildings here. There's a spur of the Speyside Way comes along here. So people do come along and see these ruins occasionally. It was all mapped in 1773 by Thomas Milne, who mapped all the Duke's farms in Strathan, where Tomintoul is, and neighbouring Glenlivet, one or two other of his properties. Now, these maps have got tremendous amounts of detail. There we go. We can zoom in on that one, and that's for the Ichcan or Ichdan is how it says spelt on Milne's map. And this is the bit we were looking at. He shows the buildings, he shows some enclosures, and best of all, he names the tenants in each house. So we've got Robert Fleming, Helen Grant, and John Grant. And we can map these. Well, we have surveyed this site with the local community, and it's now in the archive up there in the community archive up in Tomintoul. John Grant's house we can identify as that one. Helen Grant's appear to be that one. Oh, let's go back. This house here is probably this one here, and there's its attached enclosure. A bit of this enclosure survives there. Yeah, so the modern footpath, the footpath on the fence now kind of cut through somewhere like that. And the footings of these buildings can be traced more or less in the forestry beyond on the other side of the track. But the important thing for me here really is that we identify this is John Grant's house. Yeah, this is John Grant's house, where John Grant lived in 1773. And somewhere like Tom and Towel is quite for me it's extraordinary just how many people have got really firm roots in the area and can trace back many of their forebears. That's probably something it's quite common on many of the islands, I know, but less so on the mainland, where there's been more movement. So the thing here is that John Grant will have descendants living in the village, and he can probably be traced. That's not for me to do, but that's there. We can provide information and say, this is where these people lived. And, you know, this is something that will one day be of interest to somebody perhaps visiting from, you know, I don't know, the other side of the world, looking for their ancestors. And I think that's all rather fun, really. Another part of the area, this is William Anderson. I'll come back to him at the very end if I remember. William Anderson, who was another of the Duke's surveyors, and he had he also surveyed all of the properties in Strathairn and Glenlivet in a slightly different style. He's not as nearly as detailed. As you'll see in a minute, but the site which here is Knock, which is here, and in particular this site in the middle, which is called Balnapoin, and in 1763 it changes its name. We can see this is the arable. He's drawn in the arable. He's indicated some buildings. He's got little houses, and that's quite good. And he shows the main rivers, and there's the River Ann flowing. It flows downstream that way towards the Spey. 10 years later, 11 years later, Thomas Milne is back, and he draws a completely different view of this map, of this area, which there's our farm, the Knock of Inverurie, and there is the burn. Remember we mentioned the burn that comes down there. I'm going to go back previous. There's the burn coming down here, and then it swings. It's actually north, it's swinging. So it swings north there. North is off to the right. And then it kind of runs down there to the Ann. And that's that same burn coming down here. Yeah. That's Thomas Milne's map. And he shows more detail of the fields and so on. There's also overprinted on it. That's something that you get on these maps. It can be really useful in red ink. There are later boundaries. These are the straightened boundaries of the improver's mind. They are coming out, being drawn out in the state office and imposed upon the landscape. He draws so these maps, and there is actually a date on one of these. It says the boundary was put in 1822. So in 1822, some 50 years after Milne's map, we have the estate being reorganized. But zooming in on Milne, we have his settlement here. And again, he names the tenants as James Stewart and Gordon Cummins and Peter Cummins. Is it Cummins? Yeah. I've got my glasses on. They've gone. Again, lots of useful detail that can be used to kind of, you know, to flesh out the history of the area. It's not just showing you where things were. George McWilliam surveys all these estates again. In 1814. Remember, this is about 20 years after the improvements. And the burn, if you remember, came down here, and then it used to go off that way. But the burn has been canalized, and it now runs straight down that boundary that was put in the 1820s. So it's sometime before 1840 that's gone in. And this is where Milne had his settlement, and we've now got a different sorts of buildings. So there's another one. And then again, we have 30 years later, we can follow this process through. And we can look at the Ordnance Service map, which surveyed in 1869, the 6-inch map. And there is our site in Knox. There is the burn coming down, and there's the canalized bit running down into the river. And then it actually says that the name book that goes with that survey says that it's the knock is a middling-sized farm house, and I can't even read that now. I forget what it says. I don't know whether anybody's got a bigger screen than me. A middle-sized farmhouse and farm offices is the property of the Duke of Richmond, as the Dukes of Gordon had become by then. And then at the very end of that century, 1900, we have it changed again. Now that's probably, I'm not expecting you to have taken much of that bit in that sequence in, but there we summarize it here, that we've got in 1900 we have this farmstead here. That's the house and that's the offices. That's actually as they are today, and I don't have a photograph of it. Never mind. It's about, it's in the process of being redeveloped, I think, as holiday accommodation or something like that. But it is that's pretty much as it is. Before that, you can see that it is shown quite differently in 1870, and we can trust the 1870 surveyors. They've been shown to be good and reliable and good observers of these buildings. You can see that the whole thing's pretty well been rebuilt in the late 19th century. That building is the mill, because we've got the mill down there, and it runs down, and the mill is still there. You can see the mill laid coming there from the mill dam, and then it runs off, tail race runs off that way. That bit is the mill. It's still there. It's roofless wreck, but the wheel's still there. We've got George McWilliams buildings, which look at first sight just like the L-shaped thing that's shown in 1900. Yeah, it looks like to be the same thing. You make allowances for him, and it could be the same building, except the 1870 map shows us this not to be the case. So we've had several phases of rebuilding, and then before these improvements in the early 19th century, we have got this township with multiple tenants in it living here, and the footings of some of these buildings can be made out in the grass on the verges of the trackway around about here. So there's quite a lot of information to be got by using the maps in sequence. And that's quite an important thing. And we try and promote the use of that a lot, because what I was saying about what the Fairhurst comment about the buildings being unreliable because they're going to get demolished anyway, so who cares, is not, it doesn't bear out when you start looking at other maps. I think Fairhurst was just unlucky. Yeah, I just think he was just unlucky in his choice of maps and choices of sites. Had he gone somewhere else, then he might have got a different result, and we might have had many more years of people using these maps to their potential. And one place we really can explore the potential of these is on Loch Tay side. And this is where we had quite a substantial project surveying. It was 20 years ago now. We started working there when I was with the Royal Commission, and we surveyed all the visible archaeology, including all these ruins on the loch side, recording something like, we mapped something like, I can't remember how many hundreds of buildings, 300 or 400 buildings in 200 kilometers, or 150 miles of dikes and trackways and things. And we went from the top of Ben Lowers down to the loch shore. Now, we were followed by Glasgow University and various other people working in concert with the National Trust for Scotland, who own much of the land here, to explore this landscape in many different ways. There was kind of archaeology and oral history, and various soil analyses done, and environmental historical studies done. But I shan't go into that. We did the survey here, looking at all these gable ends, which are of what we call improvement type. Yeah. There we are. We have these kind of gable-ended things. You'll all be familiar. These are familiar on the mainland. Of course, we get a different name. We get hip roof buildings and so on out in the in the islands. In Tiree, you have more Outer Hebridean type black houses. But they themselves are a product of improvement, like these things are, with the gable ends and stone-built things. There is, although it gets a little bit it's a little bit difficult sometimes to disentangle the precise history of building development from the Norse period through to the 18th, 19th century on the west coast. And I'm going to just scut around that, right? I think, yeah. But we planned these buildings, and we teased out amongst these. You've got this here. We've got a typical improvement layout of a house and a byre, a house and a byre, a house and a byre. But we have got remains of earlier buildings. That's a platform there, platform there. I'll come back to these. And there's something else here, and there are other bits around there, which seem to be relics of an earlier system. But this is it. This is improvement. 1790s. This all happens on the Loch side, late 1790s, and these are very much the sort of buildings that you'd find, say, at Auchendrain, near in Bheurla, although they are maybe 20 years or so later. And then we have a hillside with it that's studded with ruined dikes, crisscrossed by ruined dikes, and in amongst them we have the remains of turf dikes, and that's what I want to just explore with you for a couple of minutes. North Loch Tayside had this quite well-known survey of 1769, which is the same year as Turnbull finished his work on Tiree, and John Farquharson, who did the work, produced 24 farm plans that are held in a book that's about rather larger than A3. It's quite a big ledger, if you like, and it's bound, and it's been known for quite a long time as an important survey, mainly because Margaret MacArthur in 1936 produced a survey, a book on it, where she transcribed the book of reference that goes with Farquharson's plans, and also of the plans of the south side of the Loch Tay that were done by another surveyor by the name of McAlpin. And
John MacArthur.
MacArthur, yeah, sorry, and she also produced an introduction to the landscape that was depicted on the maps, which I still think is one of the best summaries of pre-improvement Central Highlands that you will read anywhere. I really would recommend getting hold of that and having a read of her introduction. It's published by the Scottish History Society, and I think it's available free now on the Internet Archive. Most things are these days, aren't they? Archive.org. But anyway, this map shows Ben Lawers in the early stages of improvement. We have down here Milton of Lawers. We've got a farm into which there's been a lot of investment. It's got neat those rectilinear fields with hedgerows along them, yeah, trees planted along them for shelter. And that's all kind of neatly done. And Farquharson, in his book of reference that goes with this, says that it's below the road, and the road runs across here. The road's still more or less the same place. The road runs through here. He says below the road that it's a neat farm and it's all well improved and so on. And above the road, though, we have these irregular fields that are more characteristic of pre-improvement rural Scotland. They are really bounded by the wet bits, I think you could say, or the stony bits, so the bits that aren't cultivable, and that's probably where that's as far as people went, because people hadn't started to actually take the land, these bits in. We were some of these townships. One of them has got about 10 tenants, but who are responsible for the rent for a portion of the farm, and would get a portion of the produce. But down on the loch side, we already have an improved farm, and that's pretty much as you see it today. It's not really changed very much. You could probably, that angle is that one. The road is here, and if I let you stay at this all night, then you would you'd orientate yourself. But I'm not. I'm just going to move on, because further along the loch we have other farms. We've got the ground is much less improved. We've still got these characteristic irregular enclosures. of the unimproved farms. And I say enclosures deliberately because there's an idea that enclosure, because this is the age of improvement, it's also, people also talk about enclosures, and we have the enclosure of the communities, the common grazings at this time. But that doesn't mean that these fields were not already enclosed. And Farquharson is quite specific about this, because he shows on his map, and I'll zoom in. No, I'm going to have to I'll zoom in a minute, and we'll come to more detail. But he is showing in some of these, there's a slightly, what looks like a fuzzy line at this scale. He's actually, what he's drawn is a hedge. He's drawn a hedge around that field. He's drawn a hedge around many fields. He doesn't always draw hedges around them. Sometimes he draws a thin line, though, which we're not quite sure what that means. That could be a stone dike. But when he is actually talking about, and I'll go back previous, when he's talking about improvement dikes and improved dikes, he draws them with a very bold line. And many of these dikes are still there, and they're mostly march dikes, big things, 5 feet high, stout bases, maybe a metre high, tapered and so on, really well built, and they've stood for 200 years. And when he comes across them, he notes that approvingly. You know, that it's got good, you know, this ground is all enclosed and improved. He doesn't call this ground enclosed, although he shows it as such. So there's something in the attitude of the 18th century surveyor to what enclosure means. It doesn't seem to mean that what we would say that it's that these are open fields, which is the usual way we look at pre-improvement agriculture. Just anyway, we go on. This is the archaeology we surveyed, imposed upon it. The red is the buildings. The orange color are stone dikes, and the yellow color are what we took as turf dikes. Although I've since had it explained to me by somebody that a lot of the turf dikes, if the stone dikes, you know, have been, well, I've had lots of turf components in them and so on. But back 20 years ago, that's how we recorded them. We took that as a turf dike or a stone dike, and I'll come to. Yes, well, here we are, some detail here to show you why this, I think this is interesting. The photograph on the right shows this dike here, and we're looking at it from the northeast end. So that this is constructed, but it's a stone dike, but it's embanked with turf on one side, and you can actually see that there are individual turfs stacked in that. You could, if you're going to have an excavation, you could dismantle that systematically. It's not just a big pile of turf. Now that is shown as one of the, hopefully you can see there when I'm talking about these hedges that Farquharson is showing. So that is shown as hedged. So what I think is happening here is that you've got this sort of dike that's been built up, there's an earth component, and there's a hedge, possibly a living hedge, a quick one, or possibly just, you know, a dead one. It'd be, you know, kind of hawthorn branches or something. Both, you one find records of both. That's been put across it to keep the cattle out. So that enclosure, and you can see that we've mapped the same shape that Farquharson does. That enclosure is there in 1769. And here we have got some woodland he's showing, and the woodland, what we've mapped is pretty much as Farquharson shows it. Yeah, it started to show up as being, it started to show us that Farquharson really is quite accurate. He has, as Turnbull put it, I keep coming back to his phrase because I loved it, the local places being exactly determined. You know? Now, this was possible because we took the maps. We took these maps, and there are 3 maps put together there, and we what we call georectified them was the expression we used. We used software that we used to correct oblique aerial photographs so that we could get a plan view of what was recorded, what was showing up as crop marks. And we identified fixed points that we were pretty sure hadn't changed. The bridges, because many of these bridges were built in the 1750s, and we know which ones were. So the bridges, or the very prominent corners of dikes that are shown in Farquharson's map and are unmistakable on the ground. Sometimes the mouths of burns, although they are not so secure. We try to avoid using buildings or anything that we're, you know, that would just kind of be self, whatever, you know, would just confirm our prejudices, if you like, our choices. And but we used fixed points to get a best fit, so that the map was stretched and pushed, and pulled a little bit, just to bring it onto the modern projection. And that was what one colleague of mine really didn't like. And I was told, you're impugning the integrity of the maps and so on. But what I was really wanting to know was, what could we learn about, comparing Farquharson's map with what we've got on the ground? What would that tell us? And it worked remarkably well. I think John Farquharson, about whom very little is known, he may have been doing some work up. There's one or two other possible surveys that might be by him, but he disappears. He came from Glasgow, and he appears in 1769, and he's gone again. He may have been a schoolmaster or something who was temporarily unemployed, but his map is wonderful. And there we are, and it led us back, once we'd established this technique, it led us back to look again at some problems, and we realized that our preconceptions about what was being shown on the 769 map were kind of wrong, because we realized we were looking in the wrong place, because if we trusted him, then we go to where he says things like, oh look, we missed that. There's something in perhaps we'd been there in summer and something was hidden in the bracken. We went back and we realized that there was more archaeology to be found. There's a bit of a drift in his map, certainly, but you could work out more or less where he was standing, because the drifts, the inaccuracies would increase away from certain points. So clearly he had a theodolite on some hillock, and he was surveying away, but he wasn't getting, the inaccuracies were creeping in as his two assistants through the chain. Great stuff. Anyway, another example then of what he was doing was this site at Maragdow, the Black Markland, and which is shown down here. I've shown you this plan already. We've got this improved period farmstead. There are 3 farmsteads, 3 households living there. But back in 1769, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buildings there. And when we started surveying, we realized that there were, as well as the upstanding things, there were these there's a platform. I'm looking down the end of a platform. It's photographs taken from here, looking that way across this platform. And then above it, half hidden by the dike, there is another platform there. And those 3, we'll come to, I think it's outlined here, yeah. First of all, this building here is pretty certainly this one. It has been shortened, probably when these things are built around in the late 1790s. It has been shortened, but the earlier footings are still there. That's quite it's longer building in 17. It's shown as a long building in 1769, and I think that's deliberate. The other 3 buildings, the 2 footings and this thing, they are shown there. 1, 2, 3, yeah, and that's 1, 2, 3. This one has been rebuilt, but it's noticeably in poorer nick than the others. So maybe not. Maybe it was just refurbished at the time. And also, you can see it is less rectilinear than some of the others. It's all a bit squeegee, yeah. There were very strict rules laid down in the 1790s about how the tenants in the new farmhouses and how they were to be built. They were to be 30 feet long by 12 feet wide within the walls, which were to be 8 feet high at the sides, and the gables were to be of stone and so on. Anyway, that's oh yeah, so that's really quite nice, in linking this map to the modern archaeology, and it just shows you just how much detail these maps can actually bring in, what stories they tell you. That's the important thing. And those earlier buildings, we saw the gable-ended ones, the improvement type. The earlier ones would perhaps have looked something like this. These examples that are all suggested reconstructions at the Highland Folk Park in Newton Moor. A great thing. If you haven't been to see it, please do. Am I talking too much? Probably am. Oh yeah. You'll all be asleep. No pictures. Yeah, again, we've got our Loch side. We could do the same. We saw this on Tom and Towel. I won't labor it, but we've got this change. We've got Maragdow is there. It goes from here 1769 to 1861, nearly 100 years later. The improvements are, if you like, completed by then, and we've got all of these buildings are roofed. They're all being lived in, they're being used, as are most of the other settlements around it. By 1900, thereabouts, the second edition of the map, and many of these buildings are roofless. They're shown as unfilled squares, so they're roofless, they've been abandoned. And in 1980, the Ordnance Survey shows that all of them have been abandoned. This up here at Carwyn, this is still roofed, but it's derelict. And I've not been there for some years, so it's probably fallen down by now. We can use, as well as looking at individual farms, so we can use these estate maps to explore, look wider across the landscape. This is the farms we were looking at. These dots and extend on either side. I didn't scan all the maps, but to them on this. But these are the settlements shown in 1769. They're all around down towards the loch in the outfields, the infields. That's the good ground that gets all the manure and is constantly cropped. And it may well have been cropped since, you know, in under cultivation, come back into the Middle Ages. All the settlements are down amongst them. The outfields are up here, just occasionally cropped and then left fallow. They would be, before being brought in, maybe after 4 or 5 years of being fallow, they would be brought into cultivation by getting the cattle onto them to intensively manure them for a while. And then they would tend to grow oats rather than barley, which is what you get down here. Oats would be grown on the outfields. And the ground would get exhausted after a few years. What happens in 1798, which is 30 years after Farquharson, is the estate really does break up all these farms, and it sends many people up onto new farms that were established on the outfields. And you have at that time lots of petitions to the Earl of Breadalbane, another Campbell, who didn't have taxmen on this estate. Everybody, all the tenants were rented direct from the estate, and lots of them are all coming up with reasons why they don't want to go to the outfields. You know, they're saying, "Oh, please, you know, because I haven't got the capital to build." There's one widow who says, "I haven't got the money to build a new farmhouse, except for my son's inheritance, and if I spend that, then the neighbours will all, you know, disown me and say that I'm just cheating him and so on." But then she says, "But, don't get me wrong. If it is your lordship's will for me to go, then I shall." They're all very careful because they're all terrified that they're going to get evicted. But later, the estate chamberlain, writing to Thomas Telford, it says that only 16 people of the 2,000 families or something on Loch-Tay side were evicted at that time, and they were malcontents anyway. He says but he regrets that because he says because the farms are too wee, and he just thought he says that basically he says the Earl was too soft. Well, I mean, that's what he says. But certainly by 1862, a lot of these farms, in fact, by the 1820s, a lot of these farms are failing. The red dots are the current, so just to go back, previous, that's where the settlements are, and they all seem to be occupied in 1769. 100 years later, that's where the red dots are the occupied settlements. There are a couple of outfield ones that are still being lived in and used. Many, many more, though, have been built in the previous 100 years and have already been abandoned. And there is a process of a consolidation. And that's, again, the estate maps help us bring that process out. We also see that's the arable, what the Ordnance Survey identify as being improved ground as opposed to rough grazing, which is in green on that. And yes, on this map, I do show that again. We've got, there's all the settlements in 1769. There's the ones in the 1860s. And that's the arable, including infield there and outfield. And we can't differentiate on the Ordnance Survey map, but that's where the arable or the improved ground is shown in 1862. That's the maximum extent of arable. We don't know it all was under cultivation at any one time. But I did some calculations, and there was a huge amount of investment here, and they increased the amount of arable ground by at most 20%. And I wonder whether with that, you know, it seems a kind of a small return for what must have been a huge amount of upheaval. But anyway, that's Loch-Tay. I'm going to come back more towards the islands. I'm nearly finished. Don't worry. This map, 1790s, the state map on Waternish on Skye that my colleagues in the Royal Commission surveyed this just before I joined the city in the late 1980s, and mapped again lots of field banks, which can be compared to this 1790s estate map. And we can, if we were to sit here all night, we could pick them out. So this is this pattern that we saw on Loch-Teesside of these small enclosures. I want to call them kind of globular enclosures, but they're not globes. That's a three-dimensional thing, aren't they? But these are regular enclosures, and you can pick out some of these as being the ones that are there in the 1790s, and that's as it is today. And some of these walls are the ones that were probably there, because this is cleared out for sheep, and nothing has happened since. On Egg, there's a similar kind of thing happening. There is a lovely estate map of Egg by William Bald from 1806, which is in private hands. I did see it once about 20 years ago, and there was a big dispute over its ownership that got into the national press. There's a story there for another day, but I don't have a copy of the map. But these enclosures here now survive under the crofts. There's kind of later crofting boundaries, sort of straight lines that run down the hill across that slide. But some of the earlier system survives, as it does in Ben Lawers. It survives underneath the later boundaries, because on Ben Lawers, what happened was the improvements were incomplete. Yeah? So quite a lot of what's left, what preceded the improvements, can still be seen. And so we come back to Tiree and James Turnbull. And as I said, I've not been there. Some of you, or perhaps, I know that some of you will know an awful lot more about this, and I'm going to get told why I'm completely wrong, but it's fine. I'll zoom in just on the one place, which is Manel, yeah. I put these up there. You'll see why I put these on their side in a minute. But we've got the Ordnance Survey from 1882 on the right, and we've got Turnbull on 1769 on the left, and we can find some common ground there. We've got that drain there, it runs there, and that's that shape there, so that gives us a fix. We've got the yellow, as I said, that's his infield, and the greenish color is his outfield, so that's occasionally being cropped. There's his boundary at the time of the farm. The later farm boundary, I assume, in the 1860s is that one. And it's all been regularized. So these fields have been, and again, I don't know how accurate they are, but these fields have been regularized. We've had it's all been changed in the intervening century, and that's as it is now. It's probably, I imagine that most of those first edition, the 1860s field boundaries are still there, but whether there is anything left of the earlier field system and the earlier settlement to be explored through the archaeology is something I'd be interested to find out. So I have to come to Tiree, and I've blathered enough, so I think I'm just going to stop. And thank you for listening.